to the challenge. Although us students cannot change the world by ourselves, we can play an important role in that process. And indeed, comrades have been doing just that. Rent strikes have been going on all across the country this year. Before lockdown, we saw unprecedented numbers of young people at climate protests. And indeed, the Black Lives Matter protests all over the country last year saw huge participation also. We can no longer live as our parents once did. And as this crisis of capitalism deepens, we will see more and more people coming to these revolutionary conclusions. And this is heartening, but it means we need to be ready with the right ideas and an understanding of how to fight back. And in doing so, we can't look at the UK alone. We have to be internationalist in our outlook and our ideas. The speed at which news of George Floyd's death circulated the globe, and the speed at which protests grew around the world also attest to this. For a more recent example, we can look at the Indian farmers' protests. There are protests in solidarity all over the world, here in the UK as well. We cannot ignore global events anymore. Indeed, internationalism is baked into our ideas and our perspectives and cannot be removed from it. The correctness of this idea has proven itself. Just look at what happened to Comrade Ammar Fayaz. He was abducted and tortured by the Pakistani state, and it was due to international solidarity and demands to release him, which Marxist societies up and down the country participated in, that he was released. Internationalism is a powerful tool in our belt, and it is only through international solidarity that we stand a chance in this fight. And on that note, I wish to extend a warm welcome to Comrade Zain from the Pakistani Youth Alliance and bring them in to speak on the position of the Pakistani students.
Hello, comrades. Thanks for inviting me to share our work we are doing here in Pakistan. And revolutionary greetings for Marxist Student Conference. And I hope this would be a step forward in building the forces of Marxism across Britain. Education was never a priority for ruling classes in Pakistan. With every government in the past period, we have seen a massive cuts on education and other social services, particularly on education. But last year was particularly more damaging for education infrastructure and an overall education sector in Pakistan. With corona pandemic, forced lockdowns all over the world, here in Pakistan also, with every sector closing, including universities, colleges, and schools. But government or ruling class was not prepared to cope up with this challenge, and they all in a sudden they close all the educational institutes, and they don't have any alternate policy how to continue with the education. And for almost a year, schools and colleges were particularly shut down, with universities to some extent pursuing with online education. But it was a farce in the name of online classes, as there was no proper facilities available for students and also teachers. Teachers were not prepared to cope up with the new mode of education. And also there was a huge divide in terms of online infrastructure like internet, laptops, and other gadgets needed for online education. So it was all a drama in the name of online classes. And side by side, universities were forcing students to pay the fees at every cost, although there was a huge economic crisis going on, with people losing, working class people losing their jobs, their houses. But universities were forcing the parents to pay fees at any cost, and government was just playing by sides and not interfering in the whole situation. And this saw a huge backlash from students all over the Pakistan against this farce of online classes. And we intervened in this situation at a time when all other tendencies were rejecting the idea of online classes. We put forward that it is a step forward indeed, and the government should provide every student and every teacher all the facilities needed for the online education, And we also raised the demand to end fees till the pandemic is over, and side by side raising our broader demands for free education for all, and the restoration of student unions, and to stop attacks on education sector. And we got huge response from students, and we organized an online rally, uh, and more than, I think, 600 students from all over Pakistan attended this online rally for provision of gadgets for online classes. And all the uh, uh, universities were and administrations were collecting fees, and schools and colleges were collecting fees, but side by side they were we saw a huge downsizing of staff and teachers, and with many losing their jobs, uh, and the remaining who were lucky to retain their jobs were saw massive pay cuts, around 50%, up to 50% of salaries were reduced in the name of pandemic, and government was nowhere to help the people suffering with pandemic, with economic hardships, and uh, corona-induced other problems. Uh, and then now lockdown is over now, but a huge number of students may never come back to campuses. Already there are more than 20 million school-going students of children of school-going age are out of campuses, and most of them are employed in child labor, and it's a very dark reality of capitalism that a huge number of children cannot even get a basic education, and the system cannot provide even to their basic rights. And similarly, we will saw continuous attacks on education sector, particularly with every coming government. The first attack education budgets, and now it is a minimal budget, not even enough to sustain the current educational infrastructures. Uh, uh, just about 1% students reach to higher education in universities of all the students registered in primary schools or middle schools. In these circumstances, when the universities and colleges opened back in October, we decided to hold a Students' Day of Action, a countrywide Students' Day of Action. But just after 2 weeks, with the spikes of corona cases, government again shut down all the educational institutions. But we stick to our campaign that we will continue our campaign at any cost, and we decided to change our tactics and strategy, and we turned towards neighborhoods, to markets, to public places, to parks, to distribute revolutionary leaflets containing slogans about free education, against unemployment, against state repression, against rising cases of harassment and rape of women in Pakistan. And we got a huge response from every neighborhood, from every city, from every village. There was an excellent response, and we were expecting that. Uh, uh, and on 20th December 2020, in more than 25 cities in Pakistan, we organized Students' Day of Action, and rallies or seminars and protests were arranged all over the Pakistan. Despite all the economic and hardships, despite state repression, during the campaign, our comrade Amar Fayaz was abducted, but it did not bow us down, and we continue to reach wider layers of youth and unemployed students and young people. And for the campaign, we distributed more than 100,000 leaflets containing revolutionary slogans and demands, transitional demands like government should increase education budget equal to 10% of the GDP, provision of gadgets for online classes, unemployment allowance for unemployed people. In Pakistan, during 10 months of lockdown, more than 20 million, you can say, jobs were lost due to pandemic, and government was nowhere to help. There was no, even a single penny was provided to people facing such hardships. And this was the basically objective conditions that we got huge response for our students' day of action. And despite all the economic and financial hardships, uh, uh, we organized students at multiple cities, and our aim was to establish student organizing committees. And we were successful in some areas and some cities to organize students and unemployed youth. And our task is not over yet. And during pandemic, we also started our youth paper with the name of Halla Bol. It was an online paper. Now our first print edition is under printing, and it will be out in few days. And I think it will be a very important tool to spread our ideas and to win more and more students across the campuses and beyond. Moreover, with the deepening economic crisis of capitalism and with the IMF imposed austerity, we will saw more attacks on education. Recently, a few weeks back, we saw a protest movement that started spontaneously against on-campus examination, and which bereaved state police brutality in its first form. Many students were arrested just for protesting against the administration decision to conduct on-campus examination during pandemic. And our comrades intervened in this protest movement, and in many places, comrades of Progressive Youth Lines were in leading position, particularly in Lahore, in capital Islamabad, where we also organized a student rights committee comprising students of different campuses. And one thing was very striking of, I'm summing up, of this movement, that we saw an excellent scenes of cross-campus solidarity with students from multiple universities and colleges protesting unitedly against this decision. And we are aware that under capitalism, for majority of the working class people, for the children, they cannot even have access for free education. And already the education infrastructure in Pakistan is collapsing, and we are continuing our struggle for free education, for restoration of student unions, for end to harassment on campuses and beyond, and to build forces of Marxism in Pakistan and beyond. And work of Marxist Student Federation is of very important, and it gives us courage and hope that we are not alone here in Pakistan, and our comrades and are all over the world. And like we see the successful release campaign of Amar Fyaz, and this is the way forward. And we are internationalists, and we are striving hard to realize socialism in our lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. That was phenomenal. It's lovely to hear from you. Right, I'm going to keep this panel moving, and next on our list is Tori from LSE Marxist Society.
Yeah, hi. I'd love to introduce myself. My name is Tori Anderson. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So my name is Tori, and I'm a comrade from the US, as you might be able to tell, but I'm studying at the London School of Economics, so I'm with the Central London branch. and I'm leading the LSE Rindstrike, and I represent us at the national Rindstrike level as a representative there, and also within the coordination body. So I'll be briefly discussing the relation of Marxist students specifically to the Rindstrike developments. So our role, kind of the outlets where our point of view is most useful, where it's been helpful so far, and where it can be helpful in the future. So I'll start with, I think, one of the most pertinent questions. And I don't know if I've already stated this. I'm just going to be speaking sort of on the Rindstrikes and definitely just the Marxist kind of relation to them, as that's definitely most useful to this conference. So the Marxist Student Federation in the Rindstrike movement and the role of the Marxists. That's kind of the first point. So what we're doing firstly is we're leading local Rindstrikes, a lot of the Marxists are, and we're also organizing the national movement as representatives. So we are leaders in this movement. We're shaping the trajectory of the movement. And we'll get into leadership, obviously, a little bit more in depth later at the next session. But I think it is crucial that we at least touch on leadership as it relates specifically to Marxists and the Rindstrike at the moment, as it has been a very pivotal issue at the national level. So what are the benefits of a Marxist leadership specifically pertinent to the Rindstrikes? Lenin says in his What Is to Be Done that the weakness of a movement lies in the lack of consciousness and initiative among the leaders. And I'd say that to an extent, this is what we're seeing in the national Rindstrike movement today. Because if you take, on the other hand, some of these local Rindstrikes, which are somewhat exemplary, like Brunel Student Justice, and I know the LSE Rindstrike is kind of trying to take on a similar model, on the contrary. They're led by Marxists, right? And having a movement led by Marxists is a great advantage, not only for the movement, which can benefit then from a leadership which has a really deep breadth of historical knowledge about how to organize, which is grounded in the history of the working class movement, but it's also an advantage for the Marxists themselves, right? With the Rindstrikes, we've really been given an opportunity to make it known that we are a strong point of reference of democratic practice, needs-based allocations of resources, a dedicated pre-professional revolutionary leadership, right? We're just students. I don't think we can call ourselves professional at this point. But we're certainly working towards it, and it's being really helpful to the movement because we have this kind of budding consciousness and initiative that Lenin saw necessary to the success of a movement, and we've been putting it to use with the Rindstrikes. So that being kind of a good local example of how Marxists can be very useful, we then look to the national level. So the majority of the national Rindstrike leadership does consist of very well-intentioned, as all of us are kind of in the movement. However, often reformist elements. So you can see issues such as democracy is often slightly offended, or maybe voting procedure is forfeited for consensus decision-making and these sorts of things. So speaking from experience, where the Marxists have made our most fruitful interventions thus far has been at this very intersection of leadership and democracy. Because oftentimes what you'll see with, for example, an informal or an unelected leadership is that, they'll kind of tend to deny that there's a hierarchy at all, right? We want to deny the entire existence of a power structure and say, rather it's a horizontal chain of command, but this is really rarely, if ever, the case in reality, right? So for one, such an organizational structure can really dip into anarchy quite quickly. We're kind of looking for an accountability mechanism we don't have. And then the true underlying structures of power are thrown into the shadows. So in such a scenario, what the Marxists are able to do is provide direction, right? We put forward democratic centralism as an approach, and I won't explain this very deeply. But of course, this principle kind of encompasses both leadership and democracy, which is the very essential intersection which we're doing our work at. So that's kind of Marxist leadership for you. And then we also have, on the other hand, the Marxist program, which has been quite influential in the Rindstrikes, especially some of the local ones, again, like Brunel Student Justice and the LSE. So firstly, I think it's quite fair to say that a radical program, such as a Marxist one, isn't extremely radical to students who are radicalized, right? So students are experiencing daylight robbery, daylight mistreatment by universities, and it's radicalizing the student masses. They're developing a consciousness as to their position within the system, and the deep Marxistization of university that has accompanied the crisis of capitalism is becoming extremely visible, almost undeniable, right? So the demands of the LSE Rindstrike or Brunel Student Justice, as well as the developing demands of the national movement, are radical in their substance, of course, but also in that we're seeing increasing numbers of students demanding full rent and tuition refunds and eliminations, right? Whereas we might not have seen this in the past. I know, especially in the US context, I don't know if you would ever see such a demand, right? Students don't even know that's on the agenda. So these demands aren't so radical, however, in that they succeed in answering the practical, yet the burning questions of the day. right? They are the appropriate demands, and the Marxists know this. So on the other hand, you have the program of the reformists, which I won't touch on much of what is flawed with the reformists as much as what's beneficial about the Marxists. However, I think what a lot of people tend to do is call on to capitalism to kind of give concessions that it can't actually afford. So when we call for education to be free, we often do so without the recognition that capitalism in its current stage can't afford to provide free education. So if you take education, you recognize that it's a social good in and of that it increases productivity and it allows society as a whole to improve. You still kind of have to recognize along with that, the system can't afford to increase productivity as a result of the very contradictions of capitalism. So profit is pursued at all costs, and yet we're experiencing a crisis of overproduction, right? This is a contradiction, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. So instead of investing in the rising workforce via education, we see hundreds of billions of pounds sitting in banks, right? Just completely uninvested, sitting useless because capitalism can't afford to increase productivity. And this is also because capitalism requires that sort of endless expansion, right? Into new markets to keep itself alive and budding. And you can thank globalization for this to some extent, well, to a great extent, actually, that capitalism has very few foreign markets, which it has, left at its disposal to sort of invest in and penetrate. So we've seen education, especially in the UK, I think is a great example, no matter who you are, because you could see where in 1998, we used to have free education for the most part. And we've really progressed to a point in time where we're edging toward a US style privatization. So this being the current situation, what the Marxists provide is a transitional program. And we recognize that most of the students and staff of the working class haven't reached a full sort of consciousness. So what Trotsky would advise to us, to the Marxists, is to help the masses in the process of daily struggle, to bridge, to find the bridge between our present demands and the potential of a socialist program in the future, the potential for revolution. So we use transitional demands in a lot of the local Rindstrikes and at the national level. Transitional demands, because the capitalists don't have anything to offer us but a sad future, and we kind of have to recognize this and at the point at which it's left society in comparison to where we want to go. And finally, we'll continue to recognize as Marxists that reform is not revolution, and we'll pass this on to the working class, right? That revolution still, despite the kind of process where we're going about now, as it's been democratic and no one has decided on revolution democratically in a way, I guess. But this is still ultimately the best way to achieve the reforms we seek. We're under no illusions as Marxists that capitalism will grant us the concessions that we're seeking within the Rindstrike movement, which is ultimately free education as a right. So that being said, I guess I would sum up those points about Marxist leadership and the Marxist program by saying, these are probably the two main areas where we've been most beneficial to the Rindstrikes, but what does that mean in practice, right? What have we really done within the national movement, especially? So we plan our interventions before every meeting, and I think a lot of these interventions have been very key. So one, we emphasize the need for national demands at the Rindstrikes, and the draft national demands are actually to be proposed at tomorrow's National Rindstrike meeting. So they're coming along. We also emphasized the role of leadership in the success of a movement, as I said, also the role of democracy. And I won't elaborate too much on this as I went over it, and we also have the third session on leadership. We've been emphasizing the need for democratic centralism over bureaucratic centralism, especially as the very creation of a national Rindstrike organization meant a bit more centralization, right, and a move in that direction. But the Marxists make a great effort to also maintain democracy in balance with centralism, because that's what's been a bit lacking, but we've been very successful in doing so. And similarly, we emphasize unity between groups, which I think is our most recent success. We're kind of saying unity over bureaucratic divide and sectarianism. And this is paid off with coordination between us at the national Rindstrike level and organizations like Liberate the University, and the future for kind of coordinated demonstrations and occupations between a lot of organizations like this. And we've also fostered a sort of open dialogue, right, which definitely didn't exist before. And meetings between groups rather than kind of hypothesizing in the absence of the other about what they might be doing. We want like full updates, full conversation, this sort of thing. And the last 2 points I'll get into in kind of the relation between Marxists and the Rindstrikes are our national demands as the MSF, which are of course extremely pertinent and appropriate. And lastly, my work on the coordinating committee. So as Marxists and the Rindstrikes, what are we trying to accomplish, right? What is the rationale behind our national demands? And I'll go into each of them just quite briefly. But it's important to recognize as kind of a summarizing point that the MSF demands answer the questions which we all come to locally and nationally. Because I remember when we were formulating for the Rindstrike Now, the National Rindstrike Network's national statement, all of us, right, and we're not all Marxists, agreed over the intent to achieve free education. But how are we to achieve these goals if our demands don't accommodate for them? Right, I think it's a pretty appropriate question. So we put forward the MSF demands because they do answer all of our questions. And you could kind of start by saying, you know, it's been forgotten to marketization, that education is a catalyst of socioeconomic development. So we demand, in line with this, that education be demarketized, beginning with the refunds of all rent and tuition paid thus far, and then released from further payments, right? We want all rent and tuition scrapped, that from in the past, especially this year and in the future. In times when capitalism is experiencing an upswing, we also recognize that educational reform and investment may temporarily be afforded when capitalism is having, you know, a good moment. However, it's in the inherent nature of capitalism and its kind of volatility that new markets must be attacked with privatization in order to maintain growth. And I think I said this a bit earlier, but this is a lot of why education has been targeted for profit, and we recognize that. And this is because capitalism is in crisis. I'm sure we've all heard capitalism in crisis. You know, it's essentially our motto at this point, but it's true, right? And education critically, kind of in contradiction to that, increases productivity, yet it's been marketized instead. It's been made a commodity of, and it's such a shame. So if I were to hammer one point home to you, it would be that bankrupt capitalism cannot afford our demands. Its contradictions have produced an unstable economic environment in which the ruling class will not invest in education, as it's not in their interest to increase productive capacity. Therefore, we're asking the capitalists to open the books, this is another one of our demands, and show us where their interests truly lie, right? The truth is in the finances. So we say, prove to us that it's not because of some lavish construction project or administrative salaries or these such things, which aren't education. So we also say that universities should be operated by students and staff in a democratic fashion according to needs, which I think we can all agree the working class best understands. They should unite, workers and students should unite and decide where the capital they produce, you know, the wealth that they produce is invested. And it's safe to say that with student staff control of the university, investment in education would not be so devoid as it is today. We also recognize that many non-Marxist programs in the past and present call for free education, but many of these, including the mainstream Rindstrike campaign, are reformist, as I've said. But we know capitalism can't afford these reforms, so we take the reforms that we can squeeze through as small victories. You know, we've been having these with the Rindstrikes, especially with Manchester and Bristol and some of the reductions they've achieved, and slowly with a lot of the other Rindstrikes as well. But we recognize that to ask concessions of the ruling class as a general note, you know, it's kind of contradictory in itself and won't ever truly, you know, give us the kind of rewards and concessions that we want. We shouldn't really expect real change if we're asking it of the bourgeoisie, you could say. So revolution, on the other hand, is actually the best mode of reform. This is the way to truly achieve the goals that we're pursuing at the end of the day. And lastly, I'd say that rent is one of the most prominent barriers to university education. And this relates back to private property, of course, which on the whole is a core and unflinching foundation of capitalism, which must be done away with. And the last kind of section I want to touch on is my work on the coordinating committee. This coordinating committee was formed out of kind of a group of representatives, one or two of us from each of the Rindstrikes, and we voted on a committee which would do a bit more of the, I guess you could say the coordination work is a bit vague at this point still. However, as Marxists, and as a Marxist on the coordinating committee, what is my experience? What are our criticisms? And how do we weigh criticisms without losing ourselves to them? How do we keep the goal in mind? So of course, I and the Marxists have these criticisms, but we have to recognize that the national work and the coordinating committee work is still ultimately essential to the success of the Rindstrikes. And we must continue to encourage local national cooperation, student staff coordination. We must champion unity, even despite our criticisms and say, unite and fight parasitic landlords, as I'm sure you've seen. We must fight the university management. And this message is at the centerpiece of all of the MSF's interventions at the national level thus far. And it's also the sentiment behind our national demands. We also recognize that there's a point at which, you know, the idea of purging the party or splits into factions become necessary. This point does exist. However, we as Marxists must not lose sight of the goal. We must see our differences with these kind of mainstream rent strikers in moderation. And this comes back to the democracy centralism balance and how we should actually allow this to affect us or not affect us. We must not become overly concerned with small issues of democracy necessarily, because after all, we win with our politics. And this is where I want to conclude, because we don't want to become, known as these great defenders of democracy, and that's all we talk about, right? Though we should never hesitate to voice our concerns in the rent strike as Marxists, but moderation is key. So we should focus on politicizing the discussion, which I know we've been advised to do multiple times by some of our leading Marxists, and it's always been the right path to pursue. And we should focus on winning the discussion with our ideas. So if I had to tell you where the Marxists have been successful and where they can be successful in the future, I think we've been ultimately extremely successul in the areas of leadership and democracy, as I first emphasized, and in the future. All we need to do as Marxists is not lose scope. I think, at the end of the day, we have the scope, we have kind of the long-term view, which will really bring us around to achieving our goals. And as long as we stay engaged in the movement, I think we'll achieve them.
Perfect. Thank you very much, comrade. Very exciting times over there at LSE. Up next is Comrade Aaron, who is a member of the National Education Union, the NEU. Please come in.
Thank you. And yeah, sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties and I can't activate my video, unfortunately. But yeah, as Deep said, my name is Aaron O'Connor and I am a primary school teacher and member of Socialist Appeal and the NEU. The NEU is the largest education union in Europe with 450,000 members. In the first 4 days of this year, 16,000 members joined when the Tory government threatened to send children and teachers back to school, despite warnings from SAGE reports about the increased spread of the new virus on the 22nd of December. The NEU held an emergency meeting on Sunday, the 3rd of January, before schools went back, with 400,000 in attendance, potentially the biggest meeting in UK political history. They instructed its members to inform head teachers it was not safe to work in schools, but they would teach from home instead. Teachers in over 6,000 primary schools did just that. Local Labour parties up and down the country passed motions of support with teachers and the NEU, and Labour MPs in Brighton and Hove even went out and told the head teachers to defy the government plans to reopen schools. The very same evening, Boris Johnson initiated a full-scale lockdown, reporting data that had already been available to the government for weeks, as if it were breaking news. What Boris didn't want to admit was that he was forced to close schools and non-essential businesses due to the organised action of teachers and support from the wider labour movement. This was a great success for the organised workers of the NEU, but this is only one battle of many to come. Actually, several Freedom of Information Act requests have been sent to the government regarding teacher absences, virus contraction rates, and deaths. On one occasion, they were reported saying that they simply didn't have the data, and another time saying it is not in the public interest to publish this data at this time. But with the limited data that we do have, we can see that contraction rates in some areas are up to 4 times higher for education staff, which also places children and their families at a far greater risk. By contrast, the Juniper Education Group, tied by 1,000 threads to big business, have carried out research into the devastating effects of the pandemic on reading, writing, and maths attainment, particularly in 6 and 7-year-olds, which backs up Boris's plans to reopen schools on March the 8th, starting with primary schools. This shows how Boris picks and chooses the data that best fits the interests of his policies and his class. We cannot leave decisions like this up to the Tories, who have shown time and time again they'll put profit ahead of lives. As the NEU suggested, the only way to ensure the safe opening of schools would be to invest in the mobilization of the supply teaching staff who've lost their jobs due to the pandemic, and the requisitioning of buildings to be made into Nightingale schools to ensure smaller class sizes. And as Marxists, we must highlight the hypocrisies, the lies, and tyranny of not only the Tory government, but the capitalist system that they represent. And we must raise the need to place schools under democratic workers' control in order for teachers to be able to ensure the safe return of schools. The government have toyed with the idea of extending the school year recently to catch up with learning, slicing 2 weeks off the summer holidays. The NEU have point blank refused, but the government have floated the idea of tempting the union with higher priority for vaccination for teachers. The NEU have never rejected summer schooling as a viable option, but they said it shouldn't be done by teachers who are exhausted by a whole year of teaching, but by the NQTs who have missed out on their second placements and supply teachers who have lost their jobs. Also, teacher vaccination priority should be based on scientific data, not as carrot on a stick for 2 extra weeks of teaching. The callousness of the Tory government has been exposed for all to see, placing profit ahead of lives in this pandemic. We have seen further polarization in the pandemic, and the bubble of the furlough scheme will pop sooner or later. We've seen rapidly increasing poverty in working class families. 4.2 million children are growing up trapped in poverty. That is on average 9 children in a class of 30. 2 million parents are unable to work due to childcare commitments, forced to take unpaid time off or quit their job entirely. This disproportionately affects the poorest families in society, with families earning £20,000 per year or less being 9 times more at risk of losing their jobs than families earning £40,000 or above. At the end of January, the NEU donated a fund of £1 million for pencils and paper for those in need, plugging the gaps that have been left behind by the Tory government. On Thursday, the government announced a further £300 million to the COVID catch-up fund, and were forced to address the 4 horsemen of the educational apocalypse: lost learning, mental health crises, safeguarding hazards, and loss of lifetime earnings of around £40,000. This is not the first time that the government has been shamed into action. It took Marcus Rashford to publicly shame the government many times over in order for them to provide free school meals during the pandemic. One Tory MP even said that free school meal provision over the holidays would take feeding responsibility away from parents and increase state dependency. Once they did roll out the food parcels, they paid a Tory donor catering company to do so, who ended up pocketing £25 out of £30 per child per week, literally stealing from the mouths of the poor. This is at a time when more parents than ever are skipping meals to feed their children. Malnutrition rates have doubled in the past year. And UNICEF, for the first time in its 74-year history, have been forced to intervene in Britain to stop children going hungry. With the capitalist system in senile decay, it has found its match in Boris's Tory government. They are unfit to rule, and the system is unfit to provide. The societal and political implications of this crisis of capitalism are so far-reaching, it will send a series of shockwaves through every industry in society, while the working class are made to pay for the crisis of capitalism. Together, workers and young people must nationalize the banks, land, and leading construction companies, build more schools, and train more teachers to have smaller class sizes, not only for the safety under the pandemic, but for every child, young person, and adult to receive free, high-quality education. As the working class will democratically plan the national curriculum, it will naturally lose its narrow horizons, and we can finally kiss 6 weeks of learning about Henry VIII and his wives goodbye. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, comrade. It's interesting to see how things are developing in the NEU. Teachers absolutely have been hit really hard in this pandemic, and it's encouraging to see, a bit of solidarity. And now, last but certainly not least, we have Dora from Ucl Marxist Society. Take it away, comrade.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me all right. Yeah, so as Deep said, my name is Dora. I'm currently the president of the Ucl Marxist Society. And I thought I would just talk a little bit about the MSF in general, and specifically the thing that I think kind of differentiates us from other organizations on the student left. So I think, just jumping off of what Tori said, I think our interventions in this Rindstrike movement have been really, really important. And we have intervened in movements of the youth and of the working class consistently, Black Lives Matter, in the climate strike movement, in solidarity campaigns like Hands Off Venezuela, and all these kinds of things. But I think the specific kind of element that has allowed us to build the MSF into what it is today. I mean, we have representatives from 40 Marxist societies here today. There's over 200 people on this call. And I think what has allowed us to build the MSF into a serious, strong organization with a national profile, as I was saying, different from other organizations on the left, different from kind of other loose-knit kind of groups of activists based on kind of friendship ties, is really the attention to Marxist theory, which I think is a really important part of what we do. And I think the best way to understand this is, we often say is that we are the voice of labor in the student movement. And I mean labor with a lowercase l, labor as in the working class movement, not necessarily the Labour Party, because I think we've heard enough about how disgraceful the current leadership of the Labour Party is. But I think what that means, and the way that we can understand this best, is to say that we are the conduits, we are the representatives of the historical memory of the working class and of the class struggle. And this is something that allows us basically to draw out the lessons of past movements of the working class and the youth, and to kind of explain and put forward the role that students can play in workers' struggles and in big movements. And I think the situation that we're kind of facing today is that you have basically thousands and thousands of young people in Britain and all around the world who have big questions about the world. They see a world in crisis. For somebody who's my age, I mean, I'm 21 now, I'm in my final year of university, and all I've ever known, my conscious life, has been a world in crisis. I was growing up in the post-2008 kind of world. So I think for people of our generation, for the people who are meeting and talking to today, they don't see the rosy post-war capitalism of kind of rising living standards and full employment and big infrastructure investments. They see a world in crisis, which is based on exploitation, which is based on oppression, which is built on exploiting divisions between people and trying to divide the working class in order to perpetuate that economic exploitation that capitalism is built on. So I think young people are really starting to question the status quo at its core. And that's where the role of the MSF is really important, because I do think that we are the only people on the left today who can truly explain the contradictions of capitalism and also how to fight capitalism. And this is reflected in the meetings that we put on at universities. So just to give you a few examples, for this year in September, we kicked off the school year, the academic year, with a national meeting on Marxism and Black liberation, because obviously, we wanted to reflect the growing interest and the growing kind of ferment amongst the youth around this question of oppression, of the oppression of people of color, and to kind of draw out really the intimate connection between racism and capitalism, and to say kind of firmly, to shout from the rooftops that, you can't have capitalism without racism, and to explain that the struggle against oppression is the struggle for a socialist society. And at UCL, which is obviously the examples that I'm the most familiar with, so I can give to you, we followed up with a meeting on Britain, sort of where has Britain been going, where is Britain going now? Because I think it's really starkly in the minds of many people that Britain has gone from being an island of stability, from being sort of jewel in the crown of global imperialism, to being one of the most unstable countries in the world, with the Scottish independence referendum and Corbyn becoming the leader of the Labour Party, and then of course Brexit, all of this kind of leading up to this instability kind of leading up to the devastating impact that COVID has had on Britain, you know, being one of the countries with the most deaths caused by the pandemic in the world. And we also had a really good discussion on COVID and the economic crisis. So really putting forward a Marxist perspective on what is causing this economic crisis that we're living through. Did the virus kind of cause it, as the bourgeois claim? And will we sort of go back to normality once the pandemic is over? I guess you can tell by the way I'm posing this question that I don't think so, and we as Marxists don't think so. And I think it's also been really important for us to have meetings on things like the climate crisis and the mental health crisis. So I think you can really see that it's not just about discussing theory in a kind of abstract way, or in a way that is kind of self-serving. As Fred, I think, mentioned in his lead off in the earlier session, you know, the way that we study Marxist theory is always kind of in a way that informs our understanding of the world today and our understanding of how we're going to fight capitalism. So, you know, for example, in a discussion on mental health, we talked about how this kind of individualistic emphasis on the mental health crisis as being, you know, a problem of individuals that just needs to be treated on a one-on-one basis. It serves to kind of obscure the broader kind of social crisis that capitalism creates through the alienation caused by exploitation, through the long working hours and menial work and just general exploitation and oppression that working class people have to endure all around the world. So I think hopefully this has given you a kind of flavor of some of the kind of meetings that we would put on as a Marxist society. And, you know, our focus is really not narrow. I think actually it's quite broad. You know, we talk often about history, about different historical events and revolutionary movements that have happened. We talk about Marxist philosophy, we talk about Marxist economics, and we're always keen to kind of also put on events about current events, like things that are going on in the world right now. So we can kind of draw on the wealth of Marxist analysis that we have coming from the whole international as well. And the other thing that is also a big part of what we do on campus is having reading groups where, you know, the genuine ideas of Marxism can really come through, and we can really analyze them in their original form as they were put forward by, by Marx and Engels and Lenin and Trotsky. Because I think, I mean, for example, I study political philosophy at uni. So I've sort of been subjected to all sorts of weird and wonderful ideas about Marxism. You know, I mean, I've heard it all. Marxism is fatalist. Marxism leaves no space for human agency. It's Eurocentric, it's sexist, it's homophobic. It's basically anything that academia needs it to be. In order to put people off revolutionary ideas and in order to maintain the status quo. And then, of course, you also have all these sorts of weird and wonderful neo-Marxist, post-Marxist, whatever label that you want to put on it, kind of ideas where you see these academics kind of masquerading as Marxists and kind of trying to use the labels and the vocabulary of Marxism to give themselves a trendy kind of sheen, but actually having renounced the very basis of Marxism, which is faith in the working class to run society for itself, and faith in the class struggle and the revolutionary potential of the working class. So in all this kind of scrap heap of ridiculous ideas, I think we as the MSF are really, you know, the only remaining bastion of genuine Marxist ideas on campus. And, you know, that's why we've become such a pole of attraction for, you know, more and more layers of young people who are coming into the university already radicalized by events, already looking for answers to the problems that capitalism is putting before their eyes. So I think everything else that we've kind of talked about, the intervention in the Rindstrikes, the intervention in different movements, our links, our kind of organic link with the working class on a national and an international scale, it necessarily has to flow from everything that I've just talked about in terms of theory. I think Engels put it better than I ever possibly could when he said that practice without theory is blind. And theory without practice is sterile. So I think that's something that sums up really well our attitude towards theory. You know, we take theory very seriously, and we have lots of these discussions and these reading groups because we want to be the people who are in the best position to explain the contradictions of capitalism, but also to elucidate the path forward towards a better world. So that's our task. And as other comrades have said, if you're here in this meeting and you haven't joined a Marxist society, if you haven't joined the IMT yet, please do so. Thank you.